Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 333. This week the questions are taken from Guide 408, that's on the Type 21 submarines. The Wednesday video looking at USS New Jersey below the waterline in Drydock, and the Friday video on the wrecks found at in Melbourne, that being HMAS J7 and HMVS Cerberus. So let's begin. A username that's just a random collection of letters as far as I can tell asks, what led to the development of the US Navy's cage mast and what's the logic behind that specific architecture? Why did it go away? So I've covered this before in various questions, but you know, there are always new people, plus I can maybe throw in a few extra bits and pieces. Cage masts were designed in the period when rangefinders and therefore latterly fire control equipment as a whole were becoming more and more important. One of the key things with a rangefinder was to put it as high as you possibly could. That meant on a mast. Fortunately, ships still had masts, albeit some of them only had little pole masts. Most navies went for tripod masts to have the strength to support the lookouts and the men to operate the rangefinders and the rangefinders themselves, which were becoming progressively heavier and heavier rather fast. And then, of course, you had things like radio equipment and such like. The concern for the US Navy was that a heavy shell, either directly impacting a tripod mast or landing very close to the base, might blow out one or more of its support legs, which could see the whole thing tumbling down, which would be bad generally, but also specifically could knock out the ship's ability to actually spot and range on its enemy, which basically would render the ship combat ineffective. And so they thought, well, if we build this lattice or cage mast, because of its rather open nature, nearby blast and shrapnel, even if it severs some of the tines within it, won't sever enough of them to bring it down. And if a shell hits it, because each individual component is not particularly heavy, the shell will just punch a shell-shaped hole straight through, and the shell will go on its merry way rather than hitting and detonating. So either way, the mast should remain intact, upright, even if a little bit damaged, and the rangefinders can do their job. The problem with the idea was that, one, obviously by their nature, they took up quite a large amount of deck space or superstructure space, depending on where they were anchored, compared to tripod masts, which you could put things in and around. They also weren't strong enough to mount other things too, like boat cranes, which was a favourite thing to stick on tripod masts if you're the Royal Navy, for example. And it turned out as well that the way they were designed early on with the pre-dreadnoughts and the early dreadnoughts, you can see here USS South Carolina, yes, they were lighter overall than tripod masts, which was another attraction theoretically, but they also vibrated and swayed an awful lot more, which made them pretty useless as rangefinder platforms. And then with the South Carolina sister ship, the Michigan, it turned out they were also quite vulnerable to storm conditions in a way that tripod masts weren't. Michigan's one actually collapsed. And so in order to keep the supposed benefits when it came to combat damage, they had to start building them heavier and heavier until you eventually get their ultimate expression with the Colorado class. And at that point, yes, they had solved the vibration issues, and yes, they weren't going to collapse in a storm, but the Colorado's lattice masts were considerably heavier than equivalent strength tripod masts. And then as time went on and you start to need more and more equipment mounted up high, you also had the disadvantage that with a cage or lattice mast, you can only stick stuff on the top and not along it like you can with a tripod, or when you have an encapsulated superstructure that takes the place of the mast like you would have in some later US ships and various ships from other navies. And so the lattice mast began to lose its attraction, especially in an era when ships were very heavily regulated in terms of their overall displacement. It was just simpler and easier to either replace them with a tripod mast, which you would see done in full or in part in a lot of US ships that got refitted during the interwar period, And then once you got into the era of the fast battleship, the tripod mast notionally was still kind of present, but had kind of been absorbed into the semi-pyramidal forward superstructure of the North Carolinas, South Dakotas, and Iowas. Palladian asks, was the Type 21 the first submarine class to be built at different locations and then put together like a German version of IKEA furniture, or was that concept developed before? It was the first submarine class where that concept was put into play on a major scale. So there were attempts at modular construction of submarines previously to the Type 21. US fleet submarines, for example, technically modular construction. However, they were constructed in sections, as far as I understand it, in the shipyard where they would eventually be assembled. So it's not like with the Type 21 where you might have some part assembled in East Germany, another part in West Germany, and then it's all brought together in North Germany for assembly. It would be a case of, well, we're building the central hull section in that, shed over there, and the bow's being built, 400 yards down the road over there, and then we're putting it all together, which is, it's still modular and gets final assembly on a slipway or whatever, but doesn't involve different locations, different factories, different blocks of workers, the way the Type 21 does. And the reason I say at scale is because, as I noted briefly in my video on the Walter and Electra boats, the long one, the Type 21 wasn't actually the first German attempt to do distributed modular construction for submarines. They had tried in the past to get their earlier submarine types shifted from a build-in-place to a distributed modular construction system. However, it hadn't really worked out, and the main system of build-in-place as one continuous unit remained for the Type 7 and Type 9 and Type 14, etc. construction. Whereas with the Type 21, it was actually implemented at scale, even if it didn't necessarily work out quite as well as they'd hoped. He also notes, could we get some more details on the last voyage of U534 in company with U3503 and U3523? Yes, but I'm going to work with the How to Fix a U-Boat dash Western Approaches dash Big Heritage, the guys who've actually got the U534 on hand, to do a slightly longer video on that at some point. Svens Scholkopf asks, were there ever any plans to use the advancements that led to the Type 21 and Type 23 classes in a major modernization program for the existing German subs, such as the Type 7 and Type 9s, something similar in execution to the post-war Guppy program in the US Navy? Not as such, no. There were some advances that were deployed with the Type 21 and Type 23 classes from the start, or near enough from the start, that would also be retrofitted back into Type 7 and Type 9s to a degree. For example, the Schnorkel, surprisingly, despite it being very heavily associated with German U-boats, didn't actually get fully implemented on frontline U-boats for quite some time during the war, to the extent that the Type 21 was actually being designed initially without one, and then only partway through the design process did testing actually reveal that, yay, hey, it works, let's implement this. And then it was sort of retrofitted into the design, but before any significant number of units had actually started being built. In fact, the first Type 21 would be finished with a snorkel in place. And you've also got other things like advanced radar systems, the Zaukönig and Zaukönig 2 torpedoes, etc., that Type 21s and Type 23s would in theory start off with having access to, that were also then refitted back into the Type 7s and Type 9s. But apart from that, and a few experimental things like anionic, I think it's how it's pronounced, tiling to dampen sound and so forth, broadly there weren't any plans for kind of Guppy program upgrades to the Type 7s and Type 9s. Partly because Germany simply couldn't afford to do it. They certainly couldn't afford to take that many U-boats offline for as long as it would take, because you'd have to, if you're doing a Guppy-style program, you'd have to essentially rip down a good chunk of a U-boat and then rebuild it. And the amount of time, especially, but also money that would take, it would actually be, at least in theory, assuming that the modular construction idea had worked out, it would have actually, in theory, have been faster and cheaper to just take the Type 7 or Type 9 in question out of service and replace it completely with a Type 21 or Type 23, which would be more capable, and you could just port the crew straight over instead. And fundamentally, even if, let's say, Germany didn't go to war quite so early and they developed these subs either in peacetime or very shortly after the beginning of some later starting World War II, even if you did completely redo the outer hull casing, etc., to be better streamlined for underwater profile work, which you in theory could do with a Type 7 or a Type 9, probably more realistically a Type 9, the simple fact of the matter is that the big point of the Type 21 and the Type 23s, which allows for all of this, is those massive extra banks of batteries stored in the secondary hull. Type 7s and Type 9s just don't have the space for you to do that in any appreciable way, shape, or form. Now, there were final designs, Type 7D, Type 9D, and so forth, which, yeah, okay, they're a bit better than the predecessors, but you just do not have all that extra space to slap that many extra batteries in unless you're going to do something really wild, like perhaps turn a Type 9 into a forward torpedo launcher only submarine, minimize crew space, essentially turn it from a deep ocean submarine into a short range, a North Sea, English Channel, Western approaches attack sub, and then fill the rear torpedo compartment and or other places with batteries and redo all the hull. Then in theory you might get something halfway passable, but even then, again, time and cost wise, you might as well just build a Type 21. It'll be easier. Josh Thomas Moore asks, in Drydock 207 you mentioned the Germans really wanted HMS Ark Royal to be sunk. Why was this? I can understand them wanting Warspite sunk, but Ark Royal seems a bit of a curious choice to me. It was a mixture of factors. Some of it was purely propaganda. The fact that, well, even though it's actually just a historic name that signifies it's a ship owned by royalty, back from, the Armada period, if you look through the German records or the records of German claims of sinking Royal Navy ships, you'll notice that ships with either Royal in the name or that otherwise have some royal connotation, like, say, Duke of York, feature a lot more in German propaganda. Essentially, they kind of figured that sinking a ship with royal or royal connotations would somehow have a worse effect on the British morale than regular ships, for whatever given value of how correct that was. I don't think it really would have made all that much difference, but there you go. Then you've also got the flip side of it, which is that at the time that the war began, Ark Royal was the newest, largest, fastest, and most capable aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy. And knocking off the biggest, meanest kid on the block always looks better, because at that point Illustrious had launched but had not yet commissioned, and also the Illustrious class was smaller than the Ark Royal anyway, so Ark Royal was the modern aircraft carrier. Everything else the Royal Navy had, Courageous class, Eagle, etc., was all either late 1910s, early 1920s vintage, whereas Ark Royal was the big new thing. And to be fair, British newsreels, etc., had made a really big deal of her launch and commission, because, of course, she was launched and commissioned in the middle of the rearmament race that was going on in the late 1930s. Another propaganda issue is the fact that once you've claimed something is sunk and it turns out it's not sunk, then you've got a bit of egg on your face, so then you really want it to be sunk, because you can say, oh yeah, well, we might have been wrong before, but actually we got her pretty soon after anyway, so ha ha. Which, well, they had to repeat it quite a few times before it actually stuck. And then on the more practical side of things, the simple fact of the matter was, yeah, Ark Royal was the biggest, fastest, most modern, most powerful aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy, and she demonstrated her capabilities on quite a few occasions in her relatively short wartime career, which meant it was just, from a purely practical perspective, an incredibly good idea to try and get rid of her as fast as humanly possible. And that ties in with the fact that being, at the time of the start of the war at least, the only fast modern carrier in British service, and even once the Illustrious class started to come online, the one that could carry the most aircraft, her loss would have a disproportionately high effect on the Royal Navy. Whereas if you sank, for example, Warspite, yes, that would diminish the Royal Navy's battle line, but in terms of fast modern capital ships, they still have Queen Elizabeth, the Valiant, whichever number of King George V are in service by that point, Renown, Repulse, and Hood from the battlecruiser side of things. So although Warspite's loss would hurt, proportionally it wouldn't hurt as much as in terms of the Royal Navy's battleship and battlecruiser force as the loss of Ark Royal would to the Royal Navy's carrier forces. And of course, battleships, although the Germans didn't have that many of them, they did have some. The Scharnhorst and then later the Bismarcks, they didn't have carriers. So it just made a lot more sense. Ark Royal, from a perspective of diminishing the Royal Navy's force and increasing the Germans' capability to operate, is a lot more valuable of a target. Brendan Buersdorf asks, I've recently come across the blueprints for a cargo ship that was described as a cattle carrier. And I'm curious, did any nations have dedicated horse carrier ships to help them move cavalry or artillery pulling horses around? Or were horses just put wherever on standard cargo ships? Yes, there were in fact dedicated horse carriers in quite a bewildering variety of shapes and sizes actually over the years, which isn't necessarily surprising given just how important cavalry was to, well, pretty much any army up until the advent of automatic firearms. Now, as I said, they came in quite a wide variety of practices. So for smaller, shallower draft ships like galleys and so forth that were either converted or purpose-built as horse transports, they would just come alongside and there'd be heavy-duty gangways, and the horse would just be walked on, placed in its position and walked off again. For larger ships, depending on how much larger, you could either use the come alongside method as usual, or sometimes if you're talking about a ship that was too large to reasonably dock up, the horses might be swum out to the ship of relatively short distance. But either way, a common option was to place them in a sling, which you can see happening in this cut-through model. The sling is attached to a block and pulley set, which is attached to a yardarm, which is attached to a mast. And using this system, you bring the horse up and aboard. It's probably not going to be the most thrilled at the prospect, which is why it's in the sling. And then they would be lowered down into the ship. And you can see there in the bottom, you have some horses in their stalls. Also still in slings, because frankly, even if you didn't chuck the horse in the water in the first place, putting a horse, or multiple horses, in a small, dark, damp, confined environment that pitches and rolls all the time is a good way to get your horse to either kill itself or kill everything around it, or go rampaging around the ship, which meant that basically they would stick them either in heavily built stalls or more usually in these kinds of static slings, so they could support themselves. They can support their own weight, but not enough with not with enough traction for them to actually get free and go charging around the ship and kick everything to death. And then obviously you can see they got feed troughs, so you feed them, etc. Now, as I said, there were lots of varieties on this. There were designs for horse transports that had loading ramps up front, so almost but not quite like a D-Day style landing craft. And then if you wanted to disembark them, again, it depended on how you were disembarking. You could normally use the mast crane method, as you can see here, just in reverse, drop them off either alongside a quay or just into shallow water. Some other horse transports, however, would have a big hatch or ramp door type thing in the side, So that would obviously allow you to load the horses directly, or if they're at the ramps in the bow or whatever, so you could load them directly, even if the ship was particularly large, if the ramp was on the bow. But it also meant you could offload them directly. Again, you could come alongside, drop it down, horses come out, or drop it down and horses jump out into the water, which is the part where you hope the horses know how to swim. If you've loaded them directly in port and you didn't realise that maybe one or two of them couldn't at that point, and so obviously you hope the sea isn't too rough, etc. Now, none of this was particularly good for the horses. As a horse owner yourself, as you indicate in your question, I'm pretty sure you understand that putting them in a belly sling and just leaving them in a small damp environment that's pitching and rolling all the time in company with a bunch of other panicked horses is not good for their health in any way, shape or form. But it was the least bad method they could think of, other than, hey, let's let them charge around inside the hold, as mentioned earlier. So that was kind of par for the course until I think around about the late 18th, early 19th centuries, when they started to, partly in tandem with the development of larger ships, develop horse transports that were a little less fatal to a good chunk of their charges. Although the loading methods themselves didn't change all that much, believe it or not. There's footage and pictures even from World War I where horses are being loaded using a system that wouldn't be entirely unfamiliar to people who are using this kind of age of sail method, just using a king post crane instead of a mast and yard. A Cooking Comb asks, hey Jack, I've got a question that's a little bit on the simpler side, or at least I hope it is. What actually are the differences between super-dreadnoughts and later battleships? I've got some idea of the ironclad to super-dreadnought progression, but I'm unsure where the line is drawn between the aforementioned ships. Well, it comes down to how you define a super-dreadnought and a later battleship. So conventionally, most people will use vague terms like dreadnought, super-dreadnought, fast battleship. I personally don't think that's as helpful as people might think. So very broadly, the differences between super dreadnoughts and later IKEA fast battleships tend to be mostly speed. So most super dreadnoughts are 21 to 23 knots, the Queen Elizabeth being an exception, but not by all that much. Whereas later battleships, when you get into the fast battleship era, tend to be 27, 28 knots minimum, and they go on from there. Also, generally, super dreadnoughts don't have anti-aircraft armament fitted as standard. Fast battleships will, whether that be dedicated AA or dual purpose. And super dreadnoughts may or may not have torpedo defense systems, and if they do, they will probably be relatively rudimentary, whereas fast battleships usually will have a fully developed torpedo defense system. However, as I said, I don't think it's necessarily that helpful a line of distinction, because there are too many slightly random variables, because technically speaking, USS Texas or HMS Orion are super dreadnoughts, but technically so is HMS Nelson. And yet there's a considerable firepower, speed, and protection disparity between those ships. So my personal way of dividing these ships up, which I may put into a dedicated video at some point or other, is actually to divide Dreadnought through to, Iowa, Vanguard, Yamato into 8 categories. And in actual fact, when you talk about 8 categories, you're essentially talking about 4 categories, each of which is split into 2 generations. So you have first and second generation Dreadnoughts, where the essential defining factor, obviously there's a lot more, but that's for another video. The essential defining factor is 12-inch guns or less. That will make your first or second generation dreadnought. The other things will be things like propulsion systems, whether or not you have wing turrets, that kind of stuff. Then you have super dreadnoughts, again in first and second generation flavors. This is based, to be honest, mostly on firepower. So a first generation super dreadnought will be 13 or 14-inch guns, up to about 10. So Orion, King George V, Iron Duke, Britannia, New York, Texas, and Nevada actually would all fall into the first generation super dreadnought category. Second generation super dreadnoughts would be ships with either 15-inch guns or 12 or more 14-inch guns. So the Pennsylvanias onwards, the Queen Elizabeths, the Revenge class, etc. Then you have treaty battleships, again, first and second generation. And the first generation treaty battleships essentially are, apart from the Nelsons, which are probably theoretically the only technical ones because they are first generation and specifically designed to treaty compliance. But I think you can also put the Nagatos and Colorados in that location because with their 16-inch armament, they are a step above second-generation super-dreadnoughts in terms of firepower, and they tend, with the exception of Nagato, to be armoured against their own firepower as well. So I would put those three classes in as first-generation treaty battleships. You then have your second-generation treaty battleships, which are what most people envisage as the treaty battleships. So your North Carolina, South Dakota, King George V, etc. Now, technically, you could go, oh, yeah, but what about 14-inch and 16-inch guns? But to be perfectly honest, if you were going to do that, you'd end up creating about half a dozen different categories just for ships built in the 30s and 40s. Then you have your final set, which are related, but I wouldn't necessarily first or second generation. I would call them the non-treaty battleships. So that would be ships whose displacement is actually basically in excess of the treaty limitations, but are built contemporaneous with treaty ships. So Richelieu, for example, would be a second-generation treaty battleship, but Littorio and Bismarck would be non-treaty battleships, which in theory at least should have somewhat greater capabilities given their excess displacement, although that doesn't always work out in practice, as we've seen. And then finally, you would get the post-treaty battleships, which are battleships that are designed either with pretty much all the escalator clauses ticked or mostly post-date the collapse of the treaty system and have no regard for it. So that would be, in terms of ships built, the Iowas, Vanguard, and the Yamatos, and would include, in terms of ships not built, the Lion class and the Montanas, for example. Napalm asks, neither of us are alternate history fans, but with that aside, what are your thoughts about the Venetian idea to dig the Suez Canal considerably earlier to cut off the Portuguese that were rounding Cape Horn and its potential repercussions globally? It's actually quite an interesting idea because we see what happens to the Mediterranean as a result of the Suez Canal's existence. Now, the Mediterranean was always a fairly vital sea to control for anyone who wanted to have a global hegemony, but it was largely in terms of there was some fairly useful trade going on inside the Mediterranean, and for, say, the British in the latter part of the Age of Sail, it was more about securing land routes to stop people marching to somewhere like, say, India, and also to support allies that you might have in Europe that or nearby who could be more readily accessed and supplied and financed by sea rather than going through hostile territory in Northern Europe. But once the Suez Canal opens, it is now a seaborne trade and lifeline to the Far East, far more reliable, cuts the journey time, etc. And the Mediterranean suddenly becomes the hotbed of where everybody who's important needs to be. So the Mediterranean fleet for the Royal Navy goes from being an important fleet to the important fleet. If the Venetians make a Suez Canal, presumably slightly smaller than the historic one that was done in the 19th century, somewhat earlier, everyone and their dog is going to be fighting for control over it, and it's going to be early enough that it's going to be quite the debacle, because let's face it, no one's going to set up some kind of international or even binational controlling body. So people are going to be fighting over control over the canal and either end of the canal ad infinitum. Plus, of course, you'd be talking about a period when Egypt is still in an on-again, off-again relationship with the Ottoman Empire, which means that you're going to have to fight the Ottomans. Now, granted, depending on when exactly Venice pulls this off, that may or may not be easy or difficult, because earlier on in the Venetians' ideas and Venice's sort of dominion as in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire was very powerful, and the Venetians digging such a thing would probably lead to the Ottomans just going, great, thanks for the canal, mate. Try and take it. Especially because they would control both sides of, on land of the canal. Whereas somewhat later on, obviously Venice's power is diminished, but given that they're trying to cut off the Portuguese, this is still relatively early on. But let's say, for sake of example, it's delayed by a century or so. Ottoman power at that point is very much diminished, and it might be slightly easier to take and hold it, especially if whichever European power decides to try and take and hold it plays, the usual divide and conquer thing and persuades Egypt to spend one of its sabbaticals from being technically part of the Ottoman Empire. But while the commercial advantages of owning and dominating it are obvious, and we know what those were historically anyway, I think the bigger repercussion is going to be the absolute firestorm of a conflict it will ignite with the Ottoman Empire in one way, shape or form, either at sea and on land, or just on land, because at any point that this is happening, if it's the Venetians doing it specifically to cut off Portuguese trade to the Far East, the Ottoman Empire is in a position to either make things extremely difficult or shut down any attempts by the Western European powers to do this, depending on how many Western powers get in on the action. You might even see a new crusade. Third Base 9 asks, a couple of questions about the New Jersey and Drydock video. First off, how high off the floor of the Drydock was New Jersey? And secondly, more fun, while in the Drydock, where would the 16-inch guns hit if they were fired? Great piloting on the drone as well. Thank you very much on the drone piloting. It was quite fun, if somewhat nerve-wracking. Now, in terms of the blocks, the exact height of the blocks, and therefore the height of the ship off of the Drydock, varies somewhat, because the line of the hull is very slightly varied. So you have your concrete blocks and then wooden packers on top. Also, as you can see here, with the stern of the ship, do you count how far is the ship off of the Drydock in terms of from the Drydock floor to the keel, or to the hull plating? Because of course then further aft the ship is higher off of the Drydock if you're going to the plating, whereas as you head further forward the ship becomes obviously a more plain, i.e. the keel is now in line with the hull plating and therefore the whole thing is a bit lower. But more generally speaking, you're looking at around 4 to 4.5 feet is the height of the Drydock blocks. So that is the height to the point of the ship they are supporting. Now, in terms of how far the shells would go, well, assuming we're firing super heavy armor-piercing Mark 8 shells, the range at New Jersey's gun elevation, which is currently 20 degrees, is just a fraction under 29,000 yards, specifically, I reckon around about 28,900 yards. And interestingly enough, actually, if you go to Google Maps as of, I think, the current time, the satellite view of the Drydock that New Jersey was in actually shows them in the process of setting up the Drydock blocks for USS New Jersey. And then obviously you can see USS New Jersey at her normal home. So this has taken a couple of months before the dry docking process began. So that's just an interesting side note. Now, if you go, because obviously you're position 4.5, 28,900 yards, essentially north and very fractionally northeast, if you're looking at the aft guns, turret 3, or south and very fractionally southeast, so north and slightly northwest, and south and slightly southeast for the bow guns, turrets 1 and 2, which means that if turret 3 hypothetically fired, then for those of you who are familiar with the general area of eastern Pennsylvania, it would be a very bad time to be either a member of the St. Thomas Church in White Marsh, or to be traveling along the Pennsylvania Turnpike Toll Road, which is, I think, Route 276, if my map reading skills aren't too bad, because that is the general vicinity of where those shells are going to land, just to the west of the Pennsylvania Turnpike's intersection with either Route 309 or I-309. I don't know. Whatever. If the Pennsylvania Turnpike is an interstate, then 309 is a route, or the other way around. Whatever how it works in the US. Of course, this is all assuming that the shells don't hit intervening buildings on their way out immediately, which especially the turret 3 guns would. But the turret 1 and 2 guns, they've got clearance across the Delaware, so they would actually genuinely land. So if you are familiar with New Jersey, this would be a very bad time to be on the Elephant Swamp Nature Trail at the junction of Elk Road and Railroad Avenue, because that is pretty much where these shells are going to land. There's also a lawnmower shop called Weber's Power Equipment, which is pretty much ground zero for the shells. So not a good time to be there either. Andres RR asks, isn't the Venturi effect the other way around? A small cross-section leads to a fast flow and a large cross-section leads to a slower flow. This is, of course, in relation to what I mentioned with regard to the Holland Tunnel and the potential vibration issues that the Iowas had, where I suggested that water coming up the Holland Tunnel but bound by the skegs could have a Venturi-like effect, which would cause a differential speed from water hitting the inboard side of the inboard propellers, as opposed to that flowing around the ship outside the skegs. Now, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if those of you in the comments work with this kind of stuff day to day, but from what I recall of my engineering notes, and specifically I was actually at the time thinking of the Venturi effect that's used for deploying aircraft exit ramps in an emergency, of all things, where you have a small amount of fast flowing air and it drags in a bunch more. But in any case, most basic Venturi demonstrations start with large aperture going to small, going back to large, whereas in this case we're starting from essentially zero, starting with a very small aperture and going to large, because in theory the rest of the water below the skeg level will be bounded just by the fact it's ocean. And whereas this is raising the volume. Now, the reason why I suggested the Venturi effect would potentially, well, it would cause a speed differential whichever way round, whether slower or faster, but the reason why I suggested it would cause it to accelerate is because, from what I recall of the Venturi effect, essentially the key thing to remember is higher speed, lower pressure, and therefore theoretically the inverse, lower pressure, higher speed. So the idea would be that because you would have a certain amount of water at the beginning of the Holland Tunnel in a very small space, and you're essentially just expanding volume within a bounded area, that would lead to lower pressure. And if you have lower pressure, then under the Venturi principles, that should lead to higher speed. And also, as far as I'm aware, when you have a fluid, in this case literally water, but it could be anything, exiting from a narrow Venturi nozzle into a wider area, you can also get a lot of turbulence, which in and of itself would cause vibration. So that was the basis of my thinking, both on site and when I made the video. But obviously, for those of you who might be working with the Venturi effect, particularly with water on a day-to-day basis, if I've got that right, please let me know in the comments below. And if I've made a mistake in my workings out somewhere, please also let me know, because hey, we're all here to learn. Scott Giles asks, Ryan of Battleship New Jersey has claimed the fast battleships were misused in the Pacific as they were not formed into their own battle line with a view to no other type of surface ship being able to survive an engagement with said battle line. In use, instead, they were dispersed to protect the fleet carriers. I think it depends on the time period, because you do have periods when the fast battleships are doing their own thing slightly separate to the carriers. For example, at the Great Marianas Turkey shoot, the fast battleships are in their own battle line deployed ahead of Mitch's carriers with the specific intention of basically being extremely large bait for Japanese carrier aircraft, because ultimately battleships are far better able to defend themselves and far more durable in the face of air attack than aircraft carriers are, especially when the battleships also have combat air patrol air cover. And so it actually proves it's a tactic that works very, very well. But in other cases, like in the various Guadalcanal battles, you have the USS South Dakota and other ships, as you mentioned, being dispersed to protect the fleet carriers, and back and forth it goes. So, for example, at the Battle of Cape Engano, prior to the battle itself, the battleships are doing carrier escort duty. In the run-up to Engano, they're actually deployed ahead of the carriers to try and catch the Japanese ships with their surface guns. Then they're sent back free of the carriers to try and engage center force, which of course doesn't work out, but then they go back to escorting the carriers again. But in terms of the general principles of we should line up all our fast battleships and send them out to engage enemy fleets, because, well, they can either run or they can die, I think that could have been a viable move, but it very much depends on when in the Pacific campaign you're talking about, because early on in the Pacific campaign, the US doesn't have that many fast battleships out there. It doesn't have that many carriers either, so it desperately needs to protect them. And fighter control and direction really isn't up to all that much, and they don't have much else in the way of decent anti-aircraft firepower for escorts either. So, for example, in the Battle of Guadalcanal, particularly the Battle of Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, that would be a really bad time to take what fast battleships you have and send them herring off after the Japanese, because, okay, the Japanese might not have anything in theatre that can go toe-to-toe with them individually, but they have an awful lot of ships in theatre, and a great number of those are armed with long lances, and with the US only having, a couple of carriers at any given point, having, let's say, Washington and South Dakota go charging off pretty much unescorted, that would be the Imperial Japanese Navy's dream come true, because they would absolutely mob them with anything and everything they have get their hands on. Aircraft, cruisers, destroyers, Congo class, whatever. Kill those capital ships in a daylight engagement. That is what the Japanese want. Conversely, advance year and a half, 2 years down the line, and you have a lot more carriers, a lot more fighters, a lot better fighter control and direction. And not only do you have a lot more fast battleships, but the Japanese have lost a decent number of ships. And on top of that, of course, because the US just has a lot more ships generally, it can defend its carrier air groups a lot better. So let's say instead of late 1942, early to mid 1944, you now have lots of fast battleships available to you. So you can actually form a battle line rather than just two. And honestly, while there is still a lot of defensive firepower and durability built into those fast battleships, if you wanted to, you could just assign even more cruisers and destroyers to the carrier task groups, which would still give you a ridiculous amount of anti-aircraft fire support in case of Japanese air attack. And at that point, yes, it could definitely be argued that if the Japanese fleet sorties you in any substantial number, you should send your battleships off to go and kill them, because it will force them to either run away, which some of the faster ships might be able to do, or stand and fight. And at that point, you probably also, again, have enough cruisers and destroyers not only to provide a ridiculous escort for your carriers, but also to screen your battleships against, the Japanese hanging back with shimakaze or something and volleying torpedoes at you. So perhaps a more aggressive admiral at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, might well, after that initial bait line worked, have turned Admiral Lee's battleships loose to go and hunt the Japanese. And indeed, Admiral Lee was offered that opportunity, but because it looked like it was going to be a night engagement and Lee wasn't confident in all of his ships being able to fight that night engagement well, he declined. But if the timings had been slightly different, or if Lee had had the time to get all his ships up to his standards for night fighting, he might well have accepted, and that would have been a good use of the US fast battleships, instead of them just becoming carrier protectors again. And as you then advance through further assaults, as and when the Japanese fleet shows up, it would, at that point and that point thereafter, be a good idea to send your battleships forward under fighter cover to deal with Japanese fleet elements, because ultimately, while air attack can and does wipe out a lot of Japanese ships, it does need quite a while to do so, whereas showing up with half a dozen or more fast battleships will end the situation a lot more decisively. So, for example, like the Battle of Cape Engano, if Halsey had unleashed his fast battleships right from the get-go, Lee probably would have come into contact with at least Issei and Hyuga before he was ordered to turn back. Or Operation Tengo. it would be entirely possible to send in airstrikes and the fast battleships. You could, for example, tell all the Avengers and Helldivers and whatever else to actually just concentrate on completely wiping out the surface escort, the 10 or so destroyers that Yamato had, and, well, a light cruiser or two, wipe all of those out, and then the fast battleships can go in and, while Yamato one-on-one in a daylight engagement might have an advantage against any individual American fast battleship, hitting it with 6, 7, or 8 of them, it's going to end very badly very quickly. And if you really, really want to stack the odds, and why not, you have the advantage, you could even go, okay, well, we'll wipe out all the escorts with the first wave, and then as the fast battleships come in, we'll send in the Hellcats and the Corsairs to absolutely smother Yamato's decks with rockets and gunfire, etc., in order to cripple its fire control systems, its rangefinders, etc., making the Yamato essentially deaf and blind, which makes it even more one-sided once everybody and their dog starts piling 16-inch shells into the game. Alcedius asks, in Drydock 325, you mentioned that battleship guns have compressed air or cold water systems to deal with propellant fumes and embers. How did those systems survive the guns firing? I wouldn't think an air hose would be able to handle anywhere near the forces that a gun breach experiences. You would be correct if we were talking about a circumstance in which the output end of the either compressed air or water system was exposed to the pressures of the gun breach when the charges are going off. However, fortunately for all concerned, they aren't. In fact, the systems are connected to the gun breach, but in between their output and the gun breach when it's in use, that is of course the breach chamber, they are shut off from access to the gun, and therefore the pressure is shut off from access to them by a series of valves, pretty tough valves. I'm not talking some little tiny thing can be easily overloaded. So once the shell is in and the breech block is closed, that is an enclosed environment. The shell is fired, obviously charge is expended, and once that is done, then the valves are opened. Depending on the period of the ship, that would either be manual or, in most cases that you're probably thinking about, automatic, or sometimes semi-automatic, in that there had to be a human in the loop to authorize them to go, but once they did so, the opening and flushing process was automatically done. But as I say, it really depends on the gun system. But that would be when the valves would open and the compressed air and or water would be admitted into the barrel. And then, of course, it'll be closed up again so that people could then work on reloading. Miko Leitner asks, when a ship is decommissioned and scrapped, what happens to all the decor and loose items like furniture, silverware, bedding, etc.? How many mementos are kept of old ships by different navies? Well, it depends on exactly what the loose items are. A lot of the time, stuff like furniture, bedding, and the more general stuff like that will be taken off the ship and recycled into the navy because, well, chairs, tables, bunk beds, that kind of stuff, usually in the span of a lifetime of most ships, doesn't actually change all that much, or even if the newest ships have something different. So perhaps you're talking about a navy where the ship being decommissioned had hammocks, and the ships currently in the navy or being commissioned have bunks. There might still be older ships in the navy that are newer than the one that's being scrapped that still have hammocks, and therefore spare hammocks or something like that might be useful for those. So that kind of day-to-day stuff very often will be just recycled into the navy, albeit if they have a massive surplus, some of it might be then sold off, surplus stores and government job lot bids and that kind of stuff. Things like silverware, which are made for a specific ship, are a little bit different. They might sometimes go to a museum, they might sometimes go into storage, they might, depending on who funded it, get returned to a funder. So, for example, in the US, if a state or a city funded the silverware for a ship that was named after that state or city, there may very well be a clause in it that that particular gift that once the ship has been decommissioned and is no longer in existence, then that silverware set might get returned to the city or state governmental facilities for display and use there. Of course, if the Navy plans to succeed the ship in question with another one of the same name, then it might be, cycled through onto that ship. This is, of course, what's supposed to happen. In terms of what actually happens, well, quite often either the last crew to leave the ship or the breaking crew, or a combination of the two, will very often purloin random bits and pieces to keep for themselves. And in terms of the Navy itself, depending on the fame of the ship, they might keep a few bits lying around, either for integration into a successor vessel or for a museum, but it really depends on how famous and how much beloved that particular vessel is. Jesus Hinojosa asks, other than refitting the Scharnhorst with Bismarck's 15-inch guns, what other equipment or changes would be prudent for the Scharnhorst refit, assuming that Germany's infrastructure could handle it and they magically had enough funds and resources to accomplish it? Well, assuming we're looking at around the time Gneisenau is supposed to be being refitted, I mean, obviously there's the bow extension to give it the buoyancy to support the 15-inch guns, but one of the other things I would seriously look into would actually be stripping out the secondary armament entirely, because in common with the Bismarcks and, well, pretty much any large German ship, heavy cruisers and upwards, they have the mixed secondary armament layout, which gives them a high number of secondary battery guns, but not actually a huge amount of firepower in either option, anti-surface or anti-air. So in the Scharnhorst case, there's a dozen 5.9-inch guns, but only 6 of them can bear per broadside, and then there's 14 105mm or 4.1-inch guns, and they're actually laid out in a slightly more sensible layout, so you don't have a case of having 7 per side. You in fact have 8 per side, because one of the mounts is super firing over the aft turret, so it can fire in either direction. But the thing is, that gives you 14 relatively small anti-aircraft guns, and then a dozen reasonably large anti-surface weapons, whereas as you compare that with anything else that uses dual-purpose weapons, well, for American fast battleships, unless you're South Dakota, you get 10 barrels for AA and 10 barrels for anti-surface on either side, so 20 in total with a 5-inch 38s, which you'll notice is 2 more barrels than the Scharnhorst have in AA in a bigger caliber, and while the 5-inch is obviously smaller than the 5.9-inch, you get 4 more barrels in the anti-surface role, and even the King George V's, which have the 5.25, so they have 8 guns on either side in anti-aircraft mode, so that's the same as the Scharnhorst, except again, bigger caliber, longer range, heavier shell, and they have 2 more guns than the 5.9, and the 5.25 is much closer to the 5.9 performance-wise than the 5-inch 38. And given that this is the middle of World War II, I think at this point it's very reasonable to say, well, look, the Germans are already planning, and indeed by the time Gneisenau goes into refit, have designed the 128mm C-41, which is essentially a 5-inch gun, and it's actually dual purpose this time. So I would strip out everything, the 105s and the 150s, and just replace them with a whole series of twin 128mm. Now, granted, there may be 1 or 2 places, particularly with the 105s, where that installation might not be entirely possible, but then again, if you're removing the 150s, you might be freeing up additional space in other areas where you could install them. And I think by retaining that super firing aft mounting, although obviously now in 128mm, plus where you could potentially position additional guns down the sides, with a little bit of reworking perhaps to the superstructure, you could easily get anywhere between a dozen and maybe up to 16 barrels either side, which would be a very considerable anti-aircraft battery. Obviously, you'd also want to update the light-medium AA. Obviously, the 20mm the Germans have is okay, but you absolutely will want to have the 37mm in the newer, more rapid-firing model. The other interesting thing would be, given that you're talking about a mid to late war refit, whether they would follow the same route that many US and British ships did of significantly reducing or even eliminating aircraft carrying capacity in favour of more radar systems and saving weight for the installation of other systems like, ironically enough, anti-aircraft guns. Greg Germain asks, in a previous Drydock you mentioned that the RMS Olympic was converted from coal to oil power. Regarding warships, why was this not done more often, and not just coal to oil conversions, but general propulsion system upgrades? How much of Olympic's structure had to be removed to gain access to these spaces, and how much of that removed structure was unbolted versus how much had to be sawn or torched off? So when you're looking at Olympic, she's a relatively special case in as much that when she's converted from coal to oil, she doesn't have her propulsion systems replaced entirely. What happens is that they are converted, so she doesn't need to go through quite the same level of cutting down and opening up that you would need to replace the boilers completely, like you would do with, say, the modernisation of a Queen Elizabeth or something in the late 1930s. Now, on the one hand, that is quicker and easier to do, albeit there's still a lot of expense involved in obviously piping oil in from newly created oil tanks, making sure said oil tanks, formerly coal bunkers, sometimes also formerly sections of the ship's holds and so forth, are oil tight. Then you've also got to add in the various systems for treating the oil before it gets into the boilers, and you have to physically convert the boilers without ripping them out. But that's still cheaper than ripping open the ship and ripping out the coal-powered system wholesale and replacing it with a new oil-powered system. The flip side to that is that from the White Star Line's perspective, it makes life easier and lets them cut down on engineering crew because you don't need stokers because you're not shoveling oil. But it doesn't materially affect Olympic's top speed all that much because at the end of the day, she still has the same boilers running at roughly the same pressure, just with a different fuel source. Whereas for warships, going through all that expense to essentially get a ship that performs about the same is not so great of an investment, especially when you consider that by the time you'd be in a position to haul a ship in for such a conversion, it's probably gained a bunch of additional weight from various upgrades and so forth since it was launched. So simply swapping over the fuel sources normally would actually still result in an overall loss of speed compared to where the ship had been when she launched. So for that reason and a number of others, it was usually desirable to replace the boilers if at all possible, because apart from anything else, if you got to a point where you were replacing coal with oil, well, technology had probably moved on a fair bit, so not only could you get a higher pressure and therefore smaller footprint boiler, but therefore you could save space and perhaps even rationalize down the number of overall boilers in the ship, which would give you a lot more volume to devote to other things, and crucially also saved weight, which would hopefully address all those pesky additional weights you've added elsewhere in the ship, and possibly also even give you increased power output. But to do all that obviously involves cutting open a large portion of the ship, going through the armour deck in particular, which is going to be quite difficult. I mean, it depends on the ship design. Some ships did have unboltable sections of deck armour above the machinery, which would make access a bit easier, but it depended on, did your ship actually have that? And if it did, was that enough to actually lift out and completely replace the machinery, or was it designed just to be able to lift out and replace components of the machinery? But the main question is, why would you be doing this for a warship? In most circumstances, you're only going to be doing it because you've been forced to do so by exterior factors like treaty compliance, or more specifically because you can't build an oil-powered successor, because the process of taking a ship in and cutting it down to a point where you can get full access to the machinery and then full-scale replacing that machinery, amongst other things, and all the other stuff we'll probably be doing at the same time, is hugely expensive. And given the relatively rapid pace of warship technological advancement between, say, the early 1910s and the mid to late 1920s or early 1930s, which is roughly when you'd be looking at the conversions happening, is such that if it's an unrestricted ship type in terms of can you actually build it, there may still be limits on weight and so forth. So destroyers, cruisers, etc. Simply put, it's just not worth converting an early 1910s destroyer or cruiser from coal to oil when you have the scope under the treaty system to just replace it with a more modern unit. It will cost you not all that much more, but it will give you a much more powerful ship. The only time it really makes any sense is in that mid-treaty period where you don't have, by treaty, the capacity to build a new capital ship, and therefore an old capital ship needs to be converted. But even then, the circle of ships that are coal-powered and need to be converted is actually very, very small. In terms of ships they actually wanted to keep past, say, the end of the 1920s, well, all the British capital ships already burned oil in that respect. So the R-class, the Queen Elizabeths, Renown, Repulse, Hood, and the Nelsons. All the modern American capital ships burned oil already. The only ones that didn't were the Floridas, which were going on secondary duty pretty soon, the Wyomings, Wyoming and Arkansas, and of course those 4 ships are 12-inch gun ships, not really front line, and then Texas and New York. Everything after that is oil-fired, and other than that, you're looking at just the Japanese stuff. So there's not actually a huge number of ships where replacing them isn't a better option, and it's actually worth in any way, shape or form converting them to oil. And in some of those cases, the situation was helped by the fact that they either had a mixture of oil and oil firing, or coal with oil firing, i.e. mixed firing already, which would make a conversion or replacement process a little bit easier depending on what you wanted to do. Of course, some were just straight up coal burners. And finally for this week, Vokir asks, I've seen several questions about why HMAS Australia was not retained. And so in that vein, in a universe where the Commonwealth nations were negotiated separately in the Washington and subsequent naval treaties, would any of them have even been physically capable of upkeeping their namesake capital ships, or was their scrapping something of a foregone conclusion? Well, Canada was just named for Canada. Of course, she was in fact Almirante Latorre, and the Chileans wanted her back, so at no point was Canada part of the Canadian Navy. New Zealand was a gift to the Royal Navy and therefore fell under the purview of the Royal Navy to maintain. The Royal New Zealand Navy wasn't quite a thing at that point, and therefore, with unfortunately New Zealand being a somewhat obsolete vessel by the early 1920s, she was always going to go to the scrappers. So essentially what you're left with is HMAS Australia, because she is part of the Australian Navy, and therefore in theory could have been continued to be operated. Now, when it comes to the Australia, she suffers from the same problem as New Zealand. She is essentially obsolete without a major refit in the 1920s, and this was one of the things that tipped the balance of her fate, because she could have been refitted and modernised, but it was estimated that doing so would cost about the same as buying a county-class cruiser outright, and the county class, of course, would continue to be supported by the Royal Navy, whereas in the Royal Navy, the 12-inch gun was considered obsolete, so you'd also have to buy in pretty much all the existing stocks of shells and charges, and they would have an expiry date, so at some point either the ship would become obsolete because you wouldn't be able to fire her guns anymore because you wouldn't have any ammo, or Australia would have to set up its own production line for 12-inch shells, neither of which were very attractive. But the overall operation and running costs for the Australia, although higher than a county, were not higher than 2 counties, and of course Australia went on very shortly after scrapping the Australia to buying the successor Australia and the Canberra. So although in the early 30s the Australian Navy budget was severely cut, in theory, the Australian Navy did have the money to keep a capital ship like Australia running. It just wasn't considered a particularly good idea. And of course, you have the fact, I suppose, that if you have one of the cruisers in reserve, i.e. not in active service, then you're saving some of the operational maintenance cost of that ship, while the other one is active, and vice versa as you swap them around. So yes, it would be possible, but realistically, if the Australians were a separate navy under the Washington Naval Treaty and were allowed to retain a capital ship, it probably wouldn't be this Australia. Now, of course, the instinct, and something I've gone for in the past, would be to go, okay, well, how about the British sell them or just give them Tiger, because that gives the Commonwealth forces as a whole an extra battle cruiser without, unduly restricting the Royal Navy itself. And the 13.5-inch gun is still going to be around and in service for some time yet. The problem with that is, of course, Tiger is somewhat old, somewhat worn, somewhat battle damaged in and of herself, and the 13.5-inch gun isn't that long for this world in Royal Navy service. If the Royal Navy was either in sort of a charitable mood or a slightly cunning political mood, I think they possibly should have actually gone, and with Australia's connivance, obviously, could possibly have gone for something even more radical, at least to us these days, which would have been to sell or gift Australia either Renown or Repulse, probably Repulse, because Repulse's maintenance cost is still somewhat less than 2 counties, and she is a modern fast capital ship, hardly used, and with 15-inch guns, that she is going to be supported by the Royal Navy going forward for quite some time. The additional benefit to that, if you're looking at it from a Royal Navy perspective of wanting to maximise the amount of guns and firepower they can get, as opposed to a Treasury perspective of wanting to save as much money as they can from the Washington Naval Treaty, is that if you essentially are eliminating Repulse from the Royal Navy's battle order, so you just have Renown and Hood, well, that leaves you with a little bit of a gap in your ideal battle cruiser force, and you don't really want to retain even more 13.5-inch ships to compensate for that. But given that the US Navy has decided it's going to build 3 16-inch armed ships in the form of 3 out of the 4 Colorados, and the Japanese have argued for 2, we know that historically everyone kind of sort of grandfathered in Hood as an equivalent to a Colorado, but if the British are playing real brinkmanship games, then they could argue, well, actually, you know what? We, as a navy, would now, in terms of modern capital ships, which is hopefully what we're all retaining, would like to build 3 modern post-war capital ships, the same way that the US is getting to build 3 Colorados, since we are on parity. Now, they wouldn't necessarily get away with building 3 16-inch armed ships, because I suspect the US Navy would be tapping its heels and pointing at Hood. But to square that particular circle, something that you probably heard me say a few times more recently, and you've probably heard Dr. Clark say as well, would be to thread the needle by saying, okay, well, we won't build 16-inch armed ships. We will build 3 modern capital ships, but instead we'll build 3 F3 class or derivative thereof battle cruisers to go with Renown and Hood. So that gives the Royal Navy 5 R-class, 5 QEs, and 5 battle cruisers, all armed with 15-inch guns, which is a rather neat little force to keep going into the London Naval Treaty. Obviously allows them to eliminate their 13.5-inch ships in line with what the Washington Treaty demands. And with good old Repulse sitting there in the Royal Australian Navy, that's a 16th 15-inch armed capital ship ready to go. And in terms of pure finances, yes, Australia would be able to afford to maintain such a ship. It would just be a question of political will. And that brings us to an end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if indeed you still are at this point, and I hope to see you again all in another video fairly soon. Till then, bye for now.